and a very warm welcome to everyone for joining us on this event on conflict de-escalation. I'm Andrew Gilmour, the Executive Director of the Berghof Foundation in Berlin, which was set up half a century ago in a divided Germany, a divided Europe, to help try and reduce tensions between East and West, but which we have adapted many times since then. And this event is held in the context of our 50th anniversary, actually. And conflict is growing throughout the world. We have, it's estimated that there are double the number of conflicts that there were just 12 years ago, and with a commensurate increase in the number of casualties, atrocities, famine, and refugees. And also, those conflicts that are ongoing tend to be more internationalized and more regionalized than they were in 2010. And it's the multiplicity of those external and regional actors that are involved in helping to keep the fighting going that makes the work of, or makes the need to find more creative solutions for de-escalating conflict, both more important, but also more complicated. And we find that, especially in the early stages of conflict, third-party players can play an extraordinarily important role in de-escalating, and whether by as mediators, monitors, or guarantors, or observers when ceasefires are being negotiated. And each of us, I'm sure, can think of several conflicts going around in the world, and most of them absolutely terrible ones, in which ceasefires are now being pushed for or negotiated with the support of third parties. And this is vital work, of course, because not only can it help reduce the suffering of civilians, but it also can help lay the groundwork, the foundation for a more comprehensive peace process. Much of the world is currently transfixed by one particular conflict going on at the moment, but it is essential that we don't lose sight of the fact that there are a number of others, perhaps equally devastating conflicts that are raging, and losing the focus on that would be something that we clearly must avoid at all costs. Of course, we recognize that each conflict is unique and embedded in a complex sort of political environment, and we would never want to present a one-size-fits-all recommendation or be prescriptive regarding any specific country context. Rather, what we want to do is open up a space for conversation about key questions that need to be addressed by conflict parties, and also using lessons from previous third-party attempts, either successful attempts or failed or less successful ones. Lessons from both categories can be extremely helpful. Creative solutions will be necessary to address the particularity of each conflict, and perhaps aided by technological innovations, but also ensuring that there is a gender-specific and the age-sensitive approach taken. We are, Berghof often hosts extremely high-quality, experienced panels, but I think today's might well be our strongest ever, with participants from 4 continents, and all of whom are of exceptional caliber, and we are honored to have them all. But I will leave my colleague Veronique, who is moderating this event, to introduce them to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Many thanks, Andrew. And also from my side, very warm welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Veronique Dudoué. I'm a senior advisor at the Berghof Foundation in Berlin. And it's indeed an immense pleasure and privilege to be able to moderate this event today in great company. Together, we'll be hearing from leading experts on observation and monitoring mechanisms in conflict de-escalation, creative approaches, best practices, and lessons learned. And we hope to take a closer look at the role of third parties, especially in contributing to sustainable cessations of hostilities and ceasefires, shedding light on their abilities to guarantee, to observe, to verify and to accompany a process of de-escalation towards sustainable peace. The time together will be spent as such. We will hear a keynote address from Ajay Sethi from the UN Mediation Support Unit, whom I'll introduce in a minute. I will then give the floor to 4 distinguished panelists, whom I will also introduce in turn. And finally, we will proceed to a Q&A session with the audience. So before starting, let me just start with some housekeeping rules on how to use this Zoom webinar. So we have enabled the live Q&A feature through which all participants can ask both content-related questions and technical questions. You can find the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can ask your questions by typing into the Q&A box. As participants, you're welcome to either use your name or to remain anonymous when asking a question. Of course, technical questions can be asked at any time and will be answered in writing. After the panel, we will move to a Q&A session during which we would invite all of you to ask your questions also via the same function, but of course, you can start sending us your questions anytime. Our IT moderators will forward the questions to me and to the panelists, and we will try to answer as many of them as possible, but of course, apologize in advance if we will not be able to address all of them during the short time frame of this webinar. So let me now turn to our keynote speaker, Ajay Sethi, who comes with us with over 30 years of cumulative professional experience in ceasefires and transitional security arrangements. Ajay is currently serving as senior advisor on those topics in the Mediation Support Unit of the Department of Peacebuilding and Political Affairs of the UN. He has worked with many peacemakers or implementers of agreements in contexts such as Afghanistan, Georgia, India, Libya, Myanmar, Philippines, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen. Ajay is also the coordinator of the annual UN flagship course on UN ceasefire mediation, and which is conducted every year in Oslo. And he's also, last but not least, the lead drafter of the DPPA guidance on mediation of ceasefires, which was launched recently. This is especially in this capacity that we have invited him today, since we've asked him to address the question, what are the key findings of the UNDPPA guidance in relation to the role of third parties, especially in early phases of conflict de-escalation? And what are open questions and considerations for all of us, and especially for third parties to consider? So Ajay, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Vero, and many thanks to Berghof to give this opportunity to us and to me especially. I look at the panel. Congratulations, you have such an illustrious panel. So I think that's credible. So I will just go back to where you left on the DPPA's guidance on mediation of ceasefires. This guidance was put out officially on 14th of September. So we had a global launch. So now, what was the need for such a guidance? The need had been felt. We had been supporting different contexts, and there is so much of institutional expertise and memory within the UN system scattered in different departments. So there was a need to basically put things in a perspective and let our special envoys be aided with such a guidance. So this was a kind of a diligent work of almost three and a half over that years. And such guidances are sensitive. So, but definitely we didn't want to be prescriptive. So this is like a baseline knowledge, but certainly it provokes the reader to seek more information and more knowledge in certain areas along a specific path. So some of these guidance points are also there. So while we were, looking at this guidance and trying to discussed this amongst ourselves as to how to, put things in a perspective which is, comprehensive. We cover all the aspects, which is very difficult task actually when you come to ceasefires, because ceasefires can't be plucked out separately from the wider context, which is political, social, economical, and all the efforts. I would say ceasefire is just an annex or a subpart of a broader conflict stabilization, conflict resolution measures, which parties take between themselves or with the aid of a facilitator or a third party. And while doing that, we realize that it is just not the ceasefire. It's not a kind of a eureka moment that happens. A much of effort goes before a ceasefire is actually agreed. And that's the zone which you are talking about, which is the efforts to stabilize the conflict, efforts to gain traction, efforts to find entry points, efforts to de-escalate. This period could extend from, I would say, 3 months to 17, 18, and 60 years as well, sometimes in some cases. So it is an important thing to understand how during this phase, the third parties, as you mentioned, have a role to play. So this was something which came up as a reckoning for us, and of course we had the institutional experience, speaking to leadership we had in FINC and other special envoys, but then it was very difficult to at least lay out all the questions. But this opportunity today, I think I'll be able to say that what we could put in the guidance and what questions still remain when it comes to the role of third parties in de-escalation, which is before the actual ceasefire is agreed upon. Although ceasefire is also a part of a de-escalatory effort when you see the broader conflict resolution mechanism. So the first question was who are the third parties. So the third parties are, of course, both national and international. So there have been cases wherein just the national third parties, business communities, religious teachers, a particular kind of a church, particular kind of a religious, mechanism was adopted as a neutral third party by the parties themselves. So I think the emphasis is more on the international third parties today in our discussion. And international third parties are also formal, like UN, informal, like yourself, humanitarian dialogue, and there are many more. So there are informal and formal zones, and then there are regional organizations, sub-regional organizations. So there is a multiplicity. There has been almost about 35 to 38% rise in the number of actors, especially in the informal zone, in the last decade or so. So whether it is supply driven, demand driven, that is not for me to say, but then we have to keep all these things in mind, that there is multiplicity of third parties there. Now, the thing is that, what is the dynamism of the space within which these third parties work to achieve de-escalation of a conflict was something we had to battle with. So the space is complicated. Now, three things come to your mind when you talk about this space: competition, complementarity, and comparative advantages. So each entity who's involved in this dynamic space of third parties brings in certain comparative advantages. What a formal actor cannot do, informal actor can do. But then what is the level of competition between them, and what is the level of complementarity, and how do you achieve that? And so the whole guidance just crystallizes in one point, which is there in part of the guidance, that relationship between all these entities has to be built in a very transparent manner, with the mutual respect as a foundation. So that is very important when you manage such space. Now, the other question that came to us, and I'm sure the fellow panelists will also be focusing on some of these answers, is who is the curator of this space, this international third-party space, which battles with the conflicts, which do not allow them even a toehold or a nail hold sometimes because of the escalatory trends which are happening on ground. So how do they connect with each other, and who's the leader? So sometimes the mandates are clear, sometimes they are not. Some things are spoken, some things are unspoken, and that is why who takes the leadership for curating this place, making this space more coordinative rather than, I would say, contrary to that, collaborative. So that's an important question which comes to mind. It all translates to the personality of people, the personalities involved, the nature of the organizations involved. But definitely, that's a very important consideration, that this space of international third parties, when dealing and engaging in the issues like conflict stabilization, need to be curated, need to be put in a perspective. There has to be a method in madness. But then who brings that methodology in that madness is a question mark. Some parties listen to each other, some don't. Some have vested interests. So that's the bigger challenge for any mediator or a facilitator who unfortunately lands up with a lead role in managing this space, and who has to work in this competitive, complementary, or a comparative advantage space which we spoke about. So these are some of the things which came about. And then other important thing before I quickly finish and lead on, give it back to you, is the de-escalation. Because de-escalation happens in all the spheres or domains, which is political in nature, economic in nature, social in nature, security in nature, or military in nature. So the de-escalation tools, modalities are one thing, but then who brings coherence to that space so that we have an added and a cumulative weight on the advocacies that we are dishing out to the parties? That's a very important, aspect to be kept in mind. In some cases, because of things which are unspoken, diplomacy, the way the diplomacy works, you are looking at a lead entity which is responsible for mediating a process, or leading the facilitative process for a conflict resolution. You see that there are certain degrees of incompetencies there. You see that they do not have that comparative advantages. I wouldn't say incompetencies, but lesser comparative advantage on few things. But then how much is the ability of any other party to come to that third party and say, okay, can we make this look like this, or do this better? So that all boils down to the cultural, contextual dynamics, and also individual personalities that come into play. But definitely these are you see some of these questions. And over to you back. The last point is that while the de-escalatory efforts are on by even the third parties, there are several of them operating in different kind of domains, which may not be kind of seen as complementing each other by the parties, not by us. These are important tracks. So some of us want to be pacifiers. We want to pacify the situation. Some of us are asking questions and asking for culpability, attribution, and accountability at the same time. So how do you put a firewall between these 2-3 efforts if the same organization is doing it? Same organization is asking for some kind of a pause or de-escalation, and the other half of the organization is asking for attribution and accountability same time, immediately. It should happen now. So then it becomes a bit of a challenge. But I'm not saying both are important. Both have very critical advantages and necessities. But then the question comes, how do you put a firewall in between all this? So these are, I'm just giving you a kind of a microcosm of all the questions that we battled with, when it comes to the role of third parties in engaging in a context in which the actual pre-ceasefire roadmap has not been charted or defined well, which will never be defined. You have to define it yourself in each context, but then who defines it and what actions are to be taken? has always been challenging. On that note, I'm sure there are fellow panelists, who will have very good insights on some of the answers. But getting back to you, Vero, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Many thanks, Ajay, for reminding us, first of all, as you said, that de-escalation and ceasefires are not a eureka moment, and also for putting the hard questions to us in terms of third parties, the need for complementarity, competitive advantage, coordination, coherence, competency, and sometimes how different roles might be incompatible. So I'm sure that we'll now be able to delve more into some of those hard questions. So I'm very happy to now start the panel discussion. We'll have 4 panelists, and they'll each have a few minutes to give an initial input on a couple of questions, and then I hope we can have a little bit of time to go into a discussion. So let me start with Nicola Haysom, who's currently the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General and head of the United Nations mission in South Sudan. He was previously the Secretary General's Special Advisor for Southern Africa and Sudan, also SRSG for Somalia, Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan, SRSG for Afghanistan, Head of Office of Constitutional Support to the UN mission in Iraq. And before his UN career, he served as Chief Legal Advisor in South Africa to Nelson Mandela's presidency. He has a background as an international lawyer and has provided mediation and ceasefire negotiation support to different peace processes, including the CPA in Sudan in 2005 and the Burundi peace talks before that. So Haysom, it's a great pleasure and honor to have you with us today. And so the questions that I will ask you to answer for us are, first of all, what is the role and added value of third-party mechanisms in the de-escalation of violent conflicts? And then more specifically, what roles can be played in the negotiation of ceasefire, of cessation of hostilities, and the monitoring of ceasefires? Thanks a lot for being with us, Fing.
Thank you very much. Essentially, I've been asked to comment on the role of third parties in 2 circumstances. Firstly, in a negotiating setting, whether it's a negotiation of a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities. And secondly, in a monitoring and evaluation role in respect of a ceasefire. Let me say at the outset, I believe they are very different roles. They should not be confused. They should not be shared, and they shouldn't be held simultaneously. The first role is similar or analogous to the classic role of a mediator, and in mediating a conflict, the mediator's task is to facilitate a voluntary agreement between the conflict parties. A compromise which rests on an underlying consensus which guarantees the sustainability of the ceasefire. She offers, or he offers, alternatives to the parties who are stuck. He does this in a high trust environment. He does it offering the potential benefits of a negotiated settlement, and on the other hand, the horror of a future without one, and in short, argues and persuades against a military solution. There's no bullying or shaming or blaming in this conciliatory role. However, in the role of a monitor and evaluator of a ceasefire, the failure to shame and blame is fatal. And I can cite examples perhaps later where this is proven to be so. I should mention that the opposite applies as well. A mediator who shames and blames, which he would be required to do while serving as a monitor or an evaluator, would also erode their capacity to mediate. In looking at what the role of a third party might be in regard to a ceasefire in a monitoring and evaluation role, I'd like to just take a step back and share with you my understanding that a ceasefire is not a kind of edict which proclaims the silencing of guns. It's the elaborate construction of a framework which is going to manage the violence and critical in managing the violence. It's going to have to require deadlines to conduct. It's going to require certain actions be discontinued. It's going to find itself in a range of enforcing a number of norms and requirements. It's going to have to investigate violations. It's going to have to identify perpetrators. It's going to have to suggest remedies. And finally, it's going to have to enforce those. Now, what mechanism is able to do this really significant job at the heart of the ceasefire? And the answer, as you're aware, is increasingly a reliance on the monitoring and evaluation mechanism. More specifically, the balance between national and third-party involvement in the composition of the monitoring body. Rather than simply relying on the parties themselves and mutual recriminations to resolve disputes between them, the practice of using national monitors comprised of the parties' cadres, which is expected to secure the parties' collaboration, ownership, and particularly importantly, access to people, places, and processes. And on the other hand, blending it with significant inclusion of international or third parties intended to secure resources, to beef up the credibility and the neutrality of the mechanism. But most importantly, to leverage enforcement of remedial action rather than indifference on the part of the third parties. Turning to Sudan and South Sudan, there's been a mixed record in the assessment of the monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. The early operation of the Bergenstock Agreement in respect to the Nuba Mountains showcased the importance of involving national monitors. Since then, there's been a mixed record by the various monitoring and evaluation mechanisms which have come into place to monitor and evaluate a range of peace agreements. There's been a poor record on consequential action based on the findings of these mechanisms. And most commentators would acknowledge that the capacity of this mechanism to properly investigate and determine the drivers of a particular conflict arriving out of violations of the ceasefire has in fact been good. The mechanisms have been effective in regard to their stated purpose. As regards the last challenge, that is the identifying perpetrators, in my view, there's a substantial responsibility in those who draft the text to make clear what the prohibited conduct is and the way in which perpetrators will be identified and remedial steps proposed. The jury remains out, however, on the Monitoring and Evaluation Commission's contribution to peace. Overwhelmingly, the identified weakness is the failure of the findings of the monitoring mechanism to lead to public repudiation of the unsanctioned conduct and political pressure on the parties. This in turn derives from the failure of the political principles that own the mechanism and to which it accounts, and who appoints the members to step up to the plate and assume political leadership. In the area in which I work, in the Horn of Africa, the finger has been most seriously pointed at the regional association IGAD for its failure to assume political leadership and responsibility for the findings and investigations of the CITISAM mechanism. I think we need to be a little bit more honest and also recognize that the African Union and the United Nations itself, as well as the region's heads of state, all of whom receive copies of the monitoring mechanism's findings and reports, have simply not responded to those reports in any effective way or in any way at all. For today's purpose, then, I want only to emphasize that in crafting monitoring and evaluation commissions, it's critical that they should not be cast as orphans, that the clear responsibility of international, external, and regional actors be spelt out in the agreement. The mechanism, quite simply, does not itself have the heft to enforce its findings. Thank you.
Great. Many thanks, Fink, indeed, for your wealth of experience and for sharing with us how both national and international players have important and complementary roles to play in the negotiation and then in the monitoring of such agreements, even though your assessment of their contributions to peace, as you said, is quite mixed so far. So let me turn to our second panelist, Teresa Whitfield, who is an independent consultant and writer, senior advisor to the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and for Conciliation Resources, issue editor of a new Accord publication on innovations in peace mediation, which I very much look forward to reading. Until very recently, from 2016 to 2022, she was director of the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs Policy and Mediation Division. And in her previous life, she worked as a journalist, also as a UN staffer in Central America in the 1990s. She has also been a fellow at New York University Center on International Cooperation, as a senior advisor to the president of International Crisis Group, and many other experiences. So Teresa, it's great to have you with us. And my questions to you would be the following. Firstly, which measures can be implemented to build trust in the process of negotiating cessation of hostilities or while in a ceasefire? And secondly, what are common dilemmas in third-party observer and guarantor roles and how to address them? Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vero, and to Berghof. It's really a pleasure to be with you and everyone else in this conversation today. Trust in the third party, and especially between the conflict parties, has to be built in the course of a negotiation. But I think we have to be realistic. It's really hard. Negotiations of this kind, by definition, take place between enemies, and building trust takes time. There are many ways, thinking about the third party, there are many ways in which the initial mandate is conferred, but the trust of the parties will also be earned by the mediator's behavior throughout the negotiation. So it's an incremental process. There are some cases where the third party might not necessarily count upon the same levels of trust with each of the conflict parties, where it can be helpful then to bring in others to balance out the team of the lead mediators or supporting arrangements that can bring in other actors. Colombia was an interesting example in this regard. The government of Colombia and the FARC guerrillas embarked on direct negotiations, not mediated, but they worked very closely with two guarantor states. Cuba had a long history with the FARC, and Norway was initially there as it had the confidence of the government. As the talks approached issues around the cessation of hostilities and monitoring, the UN also won trust because of the depth of its experience and technical expertise, and was in the end requested to deploy a monitoring and verification mission. But this was by no means obvious at the beginning of the negotiation process. So things do change over time. I wanted to say a few words also about confidence building steps, or confidence building measures, CBMs for short. These are addressed in the UN guidance, which I was honored to work on with Ajay while I was still at the UN. CBMs, confidence building measures, can be relevant throughout the cycle of a ceasefire, from negotiation to implementation, and especially when a full ceasefire or political agreement is not possible. They focus on concrete or operational issues and can be political, economic, humanitarian, or specifically related to security issues. It's perhaps helpful to think of them as building blocks, delivering short-term gains to build confidence in the negotiations and prevent the escalation of violence. Conflict parties sometimes decide to adopt confidence building measures unilaterally to signal their political will and commitment, or they may agree on them with one or more, or somewhat the other party or other parties to indicate joint signaling of the will to go forward. There are a number of specific measures that might be relevant in the context of ceasefires that I'll quickly just run through in a list, but encourage people to refer to the guidance for more information. The establishment of no-fly zones, stopping specific types of attacks or practices, orders to ensure the protection of civilians, for example, through the prohibition of conflict-related sexual violence, prisoner exchange or release, establishment of hotlines, exchanging information such as deployment maps, disengagement of heavy weapons or particular kinds of material, or stopping the laying of mines, or agreeing, for example, to a demining exercise as the talks continues. A last point on trust related to monitoring missions themselves. Joint patrols and monitoring and verification mechanisms within the missions can help build trust. We've seen lessons learned across a variety of missions, dating back, I think, to the Nuba Mountain mission in Sudan, then in Nepal, and then in Colombia, where there was a deliberate creation of tripartite monitoring mechanisms with the third party working together with the two conflict parties. And as the conflict parties worked to solve problems, monitoring, verification, trust was built within them, and they became very effective, including for dispute resolution. Turning briefly to your second question, Vero, about dilemmas. It's tricky because practically everything is a dilemma. Negotiation is about choice all along the way, and none of the choices, or very few of the choices, are easy. But thinking about monitoring and observer missions, one critical and obvious dilemma relates to the identity and then the mandate of what observers are going to be put in place. There are many, many different options, as Fink and Ajay both referred to, national or international observers, or some kind of a mix. All are possible. In one case in the southern Philippines, the Bangsamoro process, there was a national monitoring and verification mechanism operated alongside an international oversight body without being integrated within it, but there are different ways of doing this. Some of the factors which will determine which way to go are obviously local conflict dynamics, which will determine critical issues such as access and security guarantees for monitors, as well as the type of ceasefire agreement and the scale of the geography of the conflict. How inclusive to be is another dilemma, which has no easy answer. Fairly obviously, national and local civil society organizations and the communities on the ground, including women and religious leaders and different kinds of structures depending on the conflict, are critical stakeholders in any peace process. How and whether to involve them in the discussion of cessation of hostilities agreements and monitoring mechanisms will depend on the circumstances. And there are cases where the pressure of time and the urgency of stopping the fighting has pushed some actors to take shortcuts and not think sufficiently about inclusion. However, if you're prioritizing the sustainability and the broad ownership of processes within the communities and the society to which they're going to apply, it's important for parties to build awareness and support for thinking about gender diversity, the inclusion of women, but also to be thinking about age, children, many young combatants in different environments when thinking about observer mechanisms. For third parties, one obvious point is to ensure that their own negotiation teams, but also critically any observers deployed on the ground, have strong representation of women among them. This is not just because it's right in terms of gender diversity, but it really practical purposes of having good communication with women combatants and in the civilian populations. Resources are another dilemma and something which needs to be addressed early in the negotiation stage. What kind of monitoring and observation will be possible will be intimately related to what it is possible to fund and resource. And of course, There, the size of the territory, security conditions, expectations of the mandate, numbers of international staff deployed, what kind of technological tools might be available for things like information management, remote monitoring and verification functions, and data collections will all relate to resourcing. And a related set of issues and something fundamental to the implementation of agreements reached surrounds the question of timing. Most ceasefire agreements and monitoring arrangements include a timeline of activities, but I think most, if not all, timelines encounter delays and things never go quite as planned or hoped. It's important to try to be as realistic as possible, and I think timelines and a matrix of implementations are always helpful to keep things moving along, but also to build in flexibility. It's much better to find a way to reprogram deadlines than just a sense that the deadlines are being missed and the process is getting out of hand. A final point would just be to say that the involvement of third parties as signatories, witnesses, or guarantors of agreements can offer a powerful signal of political and perhaps also material support to a ceasefire agreement and to a wider peace process. Although I personally am very wary of the use of the word guarantor, as ultimately the decision to maintain or end a ceasefire or cessation of hostilities agreements is in the hand of the parties. There are obvious advantages to making sure that the third parties invested in their efforts to de-escalate and end the violence stay involved for what will be a long haul. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Teresa, for raising the question of trust and how negotiations and implementation of even small measures of de-escalation can become measures of building trust between the parties, but also pointing at certain dilemmas around dynamics of the conflict, inclusivity, resources, timelines, and themselves guarantors. So I will now turn to another expert on those issues, Ali Verji, who's a fellow of the Rift Valley Institute and a non-resident senior advisor to the African Center at the US Institute of Peace in Washington. Previously, he worked for the chair of the Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission overseeing the 2015 peace agreement in South Sudan, and also worked for the chief mediator of the IGAD-led peace process in South Sudan. He has received notably the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue Oslo Forum Peace Writer Prize in 2019 for his work on innovative ceasefire monitoring, and is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Gothenburg. Ali, it's great to have you as well with us and to bring your expertise into this excellent panel. So I would ask you to give us a few insights on elements that can contribute to effective implementation of mechanisms for more sustainable cessation of hostility and ceasefires, what to do in context of violations by the parties, and what opportunities and risks do you see with technological innovations on this topic. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vero. A lot's been said already, so let me try and confine myself to 4 points in response to those questions. The first about getting ready for monitoring. The second about addressing violations, because in many contexts, violations of some kind are inevitable. I'd then like to talk a little bit about prioritization of violations, and this comes back to what Fink and Ajay were talking about right at the beginning, thinking through the design of mechanisms. And then let's pick up a little bit on technology, and Teresa just mentioned a remote sensing technology, and I'll say a bit more about that. So getting ready for monitoring. Monitoring is a practice dilemma. When the conditions are most propitious, most advantageous for it to happen, it's probably the time when monitoring is least needed. And when the circumstances are most difficult because of the conflict context, but also inevitably for any prospective monitors, monitoring is often the most needed. And so in the sense of thinking through the idea about getting ready for monitoring, I really want to speak to the second part of this here, where the conditions are least favorable, because often we have a situation where an agreement might be reached or on the cusp of being reached. It is tenuous, there are many challenges to it, and monitoring is entering into this context. One thing I think we need to keep in mind when we're thinking through the possibility of monitoring is that peace processes often run ahead of the capacity of whatever third party, and as has been mentioned already, there could be different kinds of third party. Peace processes often run ahead of the readiness of any of these institutions to monitor. So it may say in the text of an agreement, there shall be a monitoring commission, there shall be a ceasefire committee of some kind, but what about being ready to monitor? And again, if we think about these contexts where ceasefires are often very fragile right at the beginning, then this is where monitoring can be most impactful, or the absence of monitoring can be most deleterious. That if that isn't present, if there isn't readiness to think about that, and of course we all know it takes time, whether we're talking about the UN or regional organization or a bespoke entity, for it to be unfolded and unwind so that it's present on the ground, that there is often a gap. And by the time that this momentum coming out of an agreement is perhaps elapsing and monitoring is only just getting going sometime thereafter, there's a real difficulty there. And so in terms of the question about how to improve and how to strengthen the possibility for monitoring to be effective, one of these things is thinking about monitoring at an early enough stage, because often this is one of the last things that is discussed in a peace process, in a negotiation. There shall be a commission, it's tacked on at the end, it's the last chapter of any peace agreement, and yet it's so important because of the ongoing role that it may have. And so the need to anticipate what monitoring might look like at a very early stage, because there are so many models, there are so many options, is something that is really, really important. This second point I want to move to about addressing violations. Now, if we take a tenuous conflict situation where there's an uncertain commitment to that agreement, even if it may be a voluntary agreement, violations of some kind are inevitable. Now, some of those violations might be accidents, they might be unintended, they might be relatively minor, relatively technical, and some of them might be more serious. But I think we have to think about monitoring as a venue for the continuation of the conflict. Sometimes that's continuation by violent means, sometimes it may be less about violence and just about negotiation or renegotiation of earlier commitments. And so violations might occur for lots of different reasons, but ceasefire monitors often don't have that differentiation, that distinction of considering what ought to happen despite the perhaps different motives that might be there. So when violations occur, what can be done? Think has mentioned already the idea of consequences. Often people think about, when you hear what should occur in relation to violations, accountability, sanctions. And I think before going down that very distant level of the spectrum, we should think about this as a continuum on which there can be a whole range of responses. If you look at the texts of most agreements that set out ceasefires or ceasefire monitoring, there's very little that is said about what happens in the event of violation. There's very little distinction between when a monitoring organization or a monitoring group should say this is a serious violation and in order for this to be addressed, this should occur, as opposed to one where, perhaps very little should happen. That is often left to the operational implementation of monitoring to determine. And while, of course, a degree of flexibility is very necessary, if we take it from the position of the conflict parties, it's worth thinking about at an early stage, if you are a conflict party, what would you like to see happen when violations occur? Whether it's for you or for your opponent or the party that you have been in conflict with. And that is a question that we often don't ask and we often don't see an answer to in the agreement. And so it's often left to the monitors and sometimes the mediators who continue to be involved to muddle through and think about this. And so the idea of consequences is not a single concept. It could be a whole range of things, but as I say, often we don't think about it in a collective way. And this brings up the issue of the role of information. Monitors produce a great deal of information. Some of that might find its way into the public domain. Some of it might find its way to the conflict parties. Some of it might find its way to the parent organization, whatever that might be. But again, we often don't think about how this information should be used beyond a merely descriptive, transmissional sort of sense. And if we think about the protracted conflicts as a continuation or as a place where violence and conflict continues, then clearly the role of information is very important. And since monitors produce a lot of it, there's a very important role to think about there. And this brings me to the point, the third point about prioritization of violations. Ceasefire agreements often have a very long list of what constitutes a violation, and that might range a whole manner of issues. But again, there's very little prioritization within agreements about what type of compliance is most important, and therefore what monitors should focus on most of all, how deep they should go, and what information is required in order to pursue and understand what is going on in a given country context, and what should happen to that information in terms of advising or suggesting or recommending action, follow-up, remediation. And so again, if we think about this not as one type of data, not one type of information, but many, many different types, then we might have a more nuanced picture of what monitoring looks like in practice. The last point I want to make is about technology, and particularly when I say technology, I mean remote sensing technology. Things like cameras, satellites, acoustic sensors that might help bolster the ability of human monitors to understand what is going on in a particular context. Now, of course, there's a resource question here in terms of what can actually be afforded, what's realistic to deploy. But in the general sense, there has been a lot of optimism about this idea that having such technology would really improve the capacity of monitors to monitor, but also speed up the process and therefore provide some ability to contribute further to de-escalation or to the accurate sharing of information about what is going on, so that there isn't counter response and there isn't more violence as a result of what may have occurred. There isn't the desire for cheating to happen by one party or another. Now, where there has been a lot of progress has been, again, in this collection of information. Where there's been much less progress has been in the analysis, the understanding, the consequences of having that information. And so I want to put the point that more technology does not necessarily mean better monitoring. And the idea that just because you have relatively few monitors and you might be dealing with a very large geographic context, the force multiplier effects or the monitoring multiplier effects of technology are not the same as saying that technology will lead to greater compliance. And so thinking through what the role of these additional assets might be, whether they're drones, cameras, satellites, what have you, what happens to that information? Does it get shared with the parties? To what extent does it get shared with the parties? To what extent does it inform other processes that might be going on concurrent with a ceasefire? That again, these are things that often are not thought about. It's more a question that people typically say, well, it's good we have this and therefore monitoring will be stronger. And so we need to be much more critical about thinking about this rather than simply saying it is something that should happen no matter the context. I'll stop there, Vero.
Thanks a lot, Ali, for taking us from the questions around the who should be negotiators, mediators, guarantors, monitors to the when. So early negotiation on mechanisms, but especially the question of the how and the continuum of responses and mechanisms And what you said, not necessarily the more the better. So it's about also prioritization of measures. So let me turn to our very final panelist, Shadia Marhaban, who is a long-term consultant for us, for the Berghof Foundation. She is working on many issues related to security, bringing non-state armed groups together, preparing them for peace processes and for post-war transitions. She has taken part in peace talks between the Free Aceh movement and the Indonesian government in 2005 on the negotiation panel of GAM, and her life experience has inspired her to become a mediator in many contexts. Shadia, it's great to have you with us. And my questions to you are the following. So firstly, what are concerns, constraints, and considerations of the conflict parties themselves when they are negotiating ceasefire monitoring and observer mechanisms? How to address those concerns in a meaningful way? What are the benefits of an inclusive approach that Teresa has already started to mention on gender and other dimensions of inclusivity? And maybe any thoughts on creativity and innovation in thinking about mechanisms and approaches for ceasefire monitoring and observation? Thanks, Shadia.
Thank you, Vero, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think it's very interesting hearing from all different speakers. I think ceasefire is not a mechanism to settle the conflict, but it's a mechanism to provide to de-escalate the conflict. And we all agree to that. And I think when we talk about women and taking part in cessation of hostilities, we have to look into two things. The first thing that do they have a women unit in their struggle? Because if they do, then we need to have a different mechanism or system. So this won't be a confusing model, you know, or something that we want to introduce to the non-state armed group. Because I think I'm bringing perspective from the other side. Because the responsibility is the same. If you are in the army, whether you're man or woman, the responsibility is the same. But at the same time, if you have the women unit, then the unit should be working together with the third party. I think for many separatist group or group out there that are wanting to internationalize their issue, they like to have the third party. They, in fact, they can, do better, working with the third party. That's my observation. And also the benefit of the gender inclusive, of course, it will be comprehensive. We should include all, but we have to be also realistic. If we include all, will this jeopardize the process, or will this bring benefit to the process? So we have to be really, really careful in looking at this context, in particular to the style of the guerrilla war and the style of the people who are in the decision making. Also, I think providing an expert, not necessarily from the third party, but also an external expert, like from the former combatant themselves. I think this is very useful because they can talk freely, they can be open to them. And I think this will bring a different level to the ceasefire. And also when we talk about creative and innovative mechanism, I think mutual respect and also a clear line between violation and inability for them, because for technical reason, because many armed groups, not necessarily they want to violate, but they don't know the technicalities of it, the inability to do that. So we have to look into this carefully and providing enough education and knowledge for them to be able to go to the next level. And for women, if they are living in camps, now there is a camp, there is a cantonment, they can live in the community. Then we should have, this is what the external expert will be needed outside either UN or other external parties, because they can see what are the needs for the women combatants in particular in that situation. If they live in cantonment, what do they need? We can have the same toilet, for example. So this is the kind of thing that we have to think thoroughly, and also providing space for women to be able to discuss and dialogue among themselves, and then when you are in the army, obviously you are close to the hierarchy, but at least providing this space will have an opportunity for us to know them better, to get to know how they can work with the colleague positively. And I think the last one is also to have a clear mandate. If we have so many actors as a monitor or external and monitor, joint monitoring, who will be taking action if some violation is happening? Now, this is creating a lot of confusion, to be honest. And sometimes we don't know who is who to report. And many of the women combatants have difficulties because they don't have access to this information, the right information. They don't even have a car or a vehicle to go to this and that, to give reports. So this is a dilemma. And I think inviting civil society organization or women or religious organization in the beginning, I don't think that's a good idea because it will create some kind of chaos. So I'm just talking practically from the perspective of reality on the ground, because we have to be really compact when we started. We have to be really, really not confusing for all parties and even for ourselves who are conducting and working with the combatants. And I think the accountability and sanction, just like mentioned by all speakers, is based on mutual respect and based also by obeying the rules that are provided by the organization that are monitoring the ceasefire. I think that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Shadia, for bringing your very unique perspective into these questions by thinking about the parties themselves, the women that are part of those parties, how the kind of expertise that can be brought from the outside, not necessarily from mediators, but also from other ex-combatants and former negotiators, and that kind of peer learning that can happen. And the fact that sometimes violations exactly are based on lack of knowledge rather than on will to violate. So this is a moment for bringing everyone together into more of a panel setting. And we are 1 hour into this meeting, so I think we are now going to be slowly going into the question and answer session from the floor. So let me, while everyone is coming together as a panel, maybe I'll start with one question to all of the panelists, and maybe 1 or 2 of you can answer that one while the questions are still being compiled from the audience. So maybe briefly on the issue of timing or ripeness, as it's called in the mediation world. Any clues or any tips on what is the right timing to start a ceasefire negotiation from your experiences? Have you been able to identify that? I don't know who would like to take that one. Just raise your hand. I know it's not an easy one. Shadia, I would like to start.
Okay, I will start. I think the issue of ripeness in ceasefire, in particularly when the conflict is escalating, it's already a good decision for the party to start. And of course, different level of ceasefire can be introduced to the stakeholders. However, some stakeholders or some parties may use this to make internationalize the issues or to gaining weight of their organization. So this can be normal happening at the beginning. So I would say a time frame of ceasefire should be introduced, so it's not going on for many years and not knowing what is going on the ground. So I think there should be a time frame, then should be clarity.
Great, thanks a lot. Ali, would you like to come next?
Yeah, thanks. So one thing I would say is that mediators are often under a lot of pressure to obtain a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities at a very early stage in a process. And that's for understandable reasons. There could be a very clear moral imperative to reduce violence, to avert suffering, and so on. But rather than say there is a right time always, no matter what the context might be, it might be worth thinking about whether the parties themselves see the resolution or the response to the conflict in the same way. If the mediator is too far ahead of what the parties themselves are thinking, are prepared to entertain, then you may end up in a situation where, yes, a ceasefire is declared or a cessation of hostilities is declared, it quickly falls apart, and there's a cycle of one after another COHs. And there are many, many contexts where this has happened. And there's a question about whether, if you've had 17 ceasefires, whether the 18th one will be more successful than the ones that preceded it, whether there is eventually a moment where that ripeness really comes to fruition, or whether every agreement weakens the subsequent one or makes it more difficult, let's say, for ones to succeed. But I think the key thing here is alignment of a mediator with the parties, and so that there isn't this gaping chasm between the two.
Great, thanks a lot. Let's also take Teresa's answer.
Thank you. Just building on what Ali says, I think we, from an external perspective, I think we can forget at our peril the kind of the use of force as a central political tool in the conflict. And there are often, as Ali says, pressures on the mediators and third parties to try and get a ceasefire and to get a ceasefire right at the beginning. But there are also cases where the parties, I'm thinking of Colombia, I'm thinking earlier on in El Salvador was a big battle over the sequencing of the ceasefire, where the parties will be using force as an instrument, as a political instrument, also on the negotiations. And that is something I think we have to be wary, we just recognize as a fact, even though from an external perspective, obviously the humanitarian imperative will be at the foremost of external actors who will be thinking about trying to reach a ceasefire because of what it can do in terms of civilian protection and other issues.
Thanks a lot, Teresa. I'm going to take you, Ajay, next, but if I can add one more question to you, Ajay, started to pick questions from the audience. I think the inputs that you and Finn gave at the beginning, there's been a couple of questions around those, and if I can put them together. So one question to you would be, if you, in addition to the question of timing, what are creative options to address the potentially politically motivated lack of follow-up by international organizations, such as, I think, the UN of the African Union that have been mentioned. And so how can such mechanisms be integrated into agreements to build trust of conflict parties in the process? So the issue around reasons for lack of follow-up and how to address that in the agreement. So if you can take that one as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Vero. And just first stepping back, to build up on what Ellie and Teresa very eloquently mentioned about the ripeness. These are my personal views, not the organizational views. So I just want to clarify. So in my personal view, I think the theory of ripeness, in whatever little small life I have of practitioner and dealing with people and contexts, I have never ever met a mediator in a room who says, well, now is the ripe conflict, let's go for a ceasefire. You attempt everything that you see on the horizon as a possibility, So ripeness issue comes up as an academic discussion in hindsight wisdom. Oh, when this was ripe, and the ripeness is relative, both in three terms: in scope, in time, and in space. So you could be having a ripe situation now, and and then falter the next hour, and so I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. So the issue of ripeness is relative, as I said, and you go for every kind of even a nail hold that you get on the wall just to cling on to it, and every mediator or a facilitator does that. Now you come on to the issue of ripeness in a unmediated, without any bilateral discussions between two parties, which have been undertaking under the table discussions, informal discussions, which go on for years and years together. I mean, Teresa mentioned Colombia. Let me go back to the example of Colombia. So how many years of bilateral discussions took place? there the issue of rightness comes into play more often, and that is more predictable sometimes. And who does the prediction? It is a biased prediction done by the other party, opposing party. They think that, okay, this is it. These parties, the other side has reached a point wherein they will capitulate. So that's their understanding. So the issue of ripeness in a mediated conflict, wherein a mediator is involved, he or she does not wait for a ripeness thing. They have to just jump into every opportunity that comes their way to save lives. That's the main aim. Otherwise, the severity of a conflict today is so much, and the proliferation of weapons and the intensity and the way and the intense manner in which it is brought to you. I mean, I can tell you the same number of people, unfortunately, sad story, that they get killed in a conflict 15 years ago, but there was no WhatsApp or a social media. But now, even fewer casualties in a one day can really unnerve a president of a country in a matter of hours, because you have access to videos, you have access to visual stimuli. So the ripeness issue gets all submerged in there. So you just have to go in for every opportunity you have. Now, coming back quickly to the lack of political will, I think Fink is our guru. He will have more wisdom on this. He has been trying to engineer and reconstruct political will of parties for many years. The political will, of course, I think is embedded in a broader context. So it is not only about looking at a situation wherein a party suddenly decides to be disobedient. They stop behaving, they stop doing anything just because of what? A, B, C, D. So there is some reason behind that. So in many cases, I think what we as third parties can do in terms of such processes where we see political will evaporating too fast and too early is to take support of the way the processes are engineered, the way the reporting information management is done, the way the attribution, naming, shaming, and accountability is fixed, the way the whole MNV system shall report to a bigger strategic political body, wherein the linkages to the Security Council or the regional bodies, Council for Security and Peace, is dovetailed. So this is an escalatory ladder in itself. This is a ladder which you take in terms of building up, or I wouldn't say building up, but instilling, injecting the sense of political willingness in some of the parties who are habitual offenders. But that's a matter of contextual, discussion in one context to the other. But I'm sure, I think Fink mentioned that in a specific context, but over back to you and Fink for this. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ajay. Yeah, Fink, any further wisdom on that?
Well, just on the ripeness issue, the critical word is ripening rather than ripeness. And I think that ripeness is not a static concept. It's affected by the way the mediator interacts, and he can play a significant role in ripening. I don't think ripeness was ever conceived of as a theory which would justify sitting on your hands and waiting for the perfect conditions to arise. On the more vexed question of engaging particularly the neighborhood in the settlement of a dispute, but also the subnational economic multilateral like IGAD or ECOWAS, or the African Union itself, I think we'd have to note, for the purpose of today's discussion, that the world is a difficult place to operate, that multilateralism has diminished in stature and efficacy, and that the United Nations is largely paralyzed because of the Security Council's inability to reach a decision on conflict-related issues across the world. I don't think that gives us an excuse to throw up our hands, but we certainly would want to note that as a distinction between now and 10 or 15 years ago. Notwithstanding that, I believe it's important that the architects of a ceasefire, which will also be the architects mostly of the Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, need to clearly inscribe in the text the responsibility of the neighboring leaders, for example, by requiring them to consider the reports of the Monitoring Evaluation Commission and to pronounce on them. It's difficult, you know. IGAD, for example, has serious internal tensions and domestic preoccupations, but that cannot, from our perspective, allow them to say, we are not going to take responsibility for the machinery we created. We demanded the right to appoint and to govern, and then when it comes time to hold fellow leaders to account, to wilt from that responsibility. And whether it's at the Security Council, the African Union Peace and Security Council, or in IGAD, I think the parties need to be confronted with the costs of having a leadership role. And then just a word on subsidiarity, which is frequently used to exclude organizations and multilaterals from being involved. It has a rather vexed application, and when mechanically applied, it can mean that the inappropriate multilateral organization, inappropriate in the sense that its members themselves are at cross purposes or have chosen different horses or have different horses in the race, are given the responsibility for an organization and are allowed to exclude others to become involved. I think there needs to be a more refined application of subsidiarity, which recognizes that the leadership in the resolution of a dispute should be allocated based on comparative advantage and utility and effectiveness. And we would, that's not necessarily the case, but that doesn't mean it's not an issue which we shouldn't raise and insist that it comes with good neighborliness and responsibility. Let me stop there.
Excellent, thanks a lot. I'm trying to look at two screens to filter which questions to ask you, because we just have 10 minutes left and there's lots of questions coming up. Maybe one around also what is sometimes called constructive ambiguity. So what someone is asking us, what are best practices of observer mechanisms in cases of vague or ambiguous agreements on cessation of hostilities, especially in the road to more elaborate ceasefires? Any suggestions around that, Fink?
Well, let me say I've been a proponent as a mediation technique of constructive ambiguity in appropriate circumstances, in particular when dealing with constitutional formulations which can meet the bottom lines of different parties. But I've always been clear, there is no place for constructive ambiguity in ceasefires. Ceasefires really require detail, fine geographic locations need to be specified with the greatest level of accuracy. We've seen that where there's been constructive ambiguity, people have been killed in large numbers for reporting to the wrong place at the wrong time, or for misunderstanding what is a prohibited or allowed activity, or whether they can continue recruiting or whether they can return to harvest crops. People have been killed. So I really think that in regard to monitoring and evaluation and in the regard to the broader ceasefire itself, there's no room for creative ambiguity.
Excellent, thanks a lot. Yeah, Ajay, any addition?
Yeah, I mean, very nicely put forward by Fink. I would just like to echo, one thing that the question was more about, kind of abstract or ambiguous conditions or ceasefires, and so we have to also be careful that just to ensure. I think there is a question also in the chat box that if the international community wants a ceasefire more than the parties. Very, very good question. And most of the times this is the case these days. So how do you tackle those situations? So the thing is that we should not dive too much deep into the monitoring part if we cannot deliver on it. Because if you institutionalize monitoring in a setup which does not allow access, which does not allow safety of monitors, you do not have the ability to generate third-party monitors in a situation. So So you might just end up having provisions and might set up, the third party for an ambush itself, because you will promise something which you will not deliver on. So, and nothing is set in stone. There are so many examples of ceasefires wherein everything has been incremental. You start with the basic level, and you have to understand that in an ambiguous situation where you still have some gestation period before the actual, full traction ceasefire or a peace modality comes into play, you have the option of actually, putting the senior-most in the hierarchy of armed groups or national governments in a kind of a setup. So their accountability is taken care of. Now, monitoring verification, how deep do you go in the hierarchy, right to the down to the junior-most level, or you stay close to those people through liaison coordination and not do actually monitoring initially, because we can't do monitoring in all cases. So sometimes we have to be very realistic in our expectations. But as far as the ambiguity is concerned, as being said, no ambiguity in provisions, but then don't overpromise and don't overreach. This can build up slowly as the ceasefire gains traction. So that's where I'm just stopping. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. I see, Ali, you also want to come in, and if I can add one more question to you, Ali, because there were a couple of questions addressed to you. One of them was, especially when you spoke about early monitoring under least favorable circumstances. So in those early stages, when there is no formal ceasefire agreement to monitor, but more informal confidence building measures for de-escalation, for instance, prisoner exchange, are there examples for creative informal mechanisms to observe these kinds of measures? If you could take this one, that would be great.
Okay, I just want to make a quick point on the ambiguity question. I agree with what Vinka said about the, in fact, destructive potential of ambiguity when it comes to ceasefires rather than constructive in most aspects. But I just want to point out one area where a degree of constructive ambiguity in a ceasefire, or at least in the arrangements that surround a ceasefire, might be important, and this is a very contextual answer, which is that increasingly we have conflicts that are fragmented, multi-party. There are multiple actors involved, and not all those actors might be involved in the negotiations or in all parts of the process. And this raises the wider question that Shadia was talking about in terms of inclusivity and when it's appropriate. But without going into that, if a party is not a party to a ceasefire, and the ceasefire is constructed in such a way that there is very little room or space for a party to accede to that ceasefire, to those arrangements, then perhaps in that situation, the flexibility in framing the agreement, the arrangements, in order to permit that possibility might be considered. But it's a very particular case. In relation to the second question of informality and the early monitoring, I think there's a couple of answers here. And again, as Ajay was just saying, can't monitor everything, can't overpromise. At the same time, we have this understanding that those early stages can be really important. So I think a few things are here to think about in the negotiations. What does that initial period look like? And this is something that mediators can raise as a point for the parties to reflect on. It isn't that you come to the day, you sign the agreement, and then everything is milk and honey. There is clearly a difficult moment for any agreement in its early stages, and it's very worth thinking through what ought to happen and how it might happen and what ideas the parties might have for those initial few days. I think another key area here is mobilization of civil society. And there are, we've talked a lot about the international, the formal, the regional, the sub-regional entities. We haven't talked a lot about the growing trend of civilian ceasefire monitoring or civil society third-party monitoring, which can happen in lots of different forms and which might be in many respects complementary and responsive in a way that larger heavier international monitoring cannot be. And so thinking through that complementarity of those monitoring efforts is also really key. I think the third thing I'll say, and I'll stop here, is to say that even if the mediators and the monitors have different roles, there is a transition that often needs to happen, and that isn't always something that effectuates very well. And so that key transition moment and thinking through what that looks like, what are the responsibilities and what happens in that interregnum between mediators and monitors is also really key, and something which a lot of agreements, a lot of processes don't necessarily have a lot of answers to, but could, or at least have more answers to.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Maybe briefly to Shadia, and I know it might be an unfair question, but you mentioned in your inputs kind of the difference between parties kind of willingly or unwillingly violating ceasefire agreements because of lack of education and so forth. And I think one question which pops up a lot is that ceasefires might be used by parties to regroup, to rearm, and to prepare for the next cycle of fighting. So coming from the perspective of the conflict parties, what would be your short answer to that?
Yes, I think this has been used a lot in many conflict. So that's why I think the time frame and the clarity and concise. I think bringing too many parties at the very beginning, can be complicated, because we are in the process of building the trust with parties, and at the same time trying to minimize the friction that's going to happen. And so I think that the time limit providing, and also the clarity, mechanism, accountability, mutual respect, discipline, and some of those things, and providing an expert is also an important thing, that we might think that this is unnecessary, but I think for the day-to-day report, because these people are complaining every single day, every hour they would complain. So I think there should be someone there handling this and taking this into an account, and see what are the possibilities that we can make. And in terms of rearm, looking at the various cases, I think, including myself, my organization, I think there is always this kind of possibility. But if you have a strong vision, if you give the vision to them, this is what's going to happen if you fail on this one, on the second one, on the third one, this is what going to look like. That's why the expertise can really insert to this kind of discussion, because they can be open to them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shadia. And I think the last word is going to be to Teresa.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I don't think we should be surprised that conflict parties behave like conflict parties all through processes. They're in a conflict because they want to win, and they will do what they can to win militarily. And when they get to a peace process, they will do what they can to have the best possible outcome for themselves through the peace process. So the point really is that in thinking about ceasefires, which is critical, we can't lose sight of the political relationship between a ceasefire and the broader effort towards peace.
Excellent. No, thanks for reminding us indeed that those ceasefire or presumably technical negotiations happen in a broader political environment. Now, time has run too fast. It's already 1.5 hours into our discussion. So unless there's any present last minute comments by any of you, I think I'll have to thank all 5 of you and Andrew earlier for this really interesting and intense discussion. I hope it's been as interesting to all of the audience as it's been to me. So I wish you all a great rest of the day, and thanks and bye-bye from my side.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.